It seems that everyone, absolutely everyone, when summer vacation comes, goes traveling. And in the fall, during the first days of September, no one has time for lessons. Mildred's classmates tell who has been where, trying to remember the brightest moments and outdo each other. Olin in Thailand rode an elephant. Caleb in Egypt with his parents went on a desert safari, and at night, together with other tourists, climbed Mount Moses to meet the dawn. Emily found Bulgaria boring. Max enjoyed diving in the Red Sea. Mildred was sent to the country every summer. And not even to her own grandmother, but to some seventh water on the vine. And it was especially hurt Mildred could tell her grandmother where Mildred had seen this vegetable garden. These stupid chickens who wanted to peck her hands, and for diving, there was only a river, which the same chickens would wade across. But try telling that to your 7th great-grandmother. Delia Gassman had been the school's vice principal for the last 20 years, and Mildred's parents were particularly fond of it. "I'll rest easy. She'll be able to keep an eye on you," Mom said. She didn't rely on herself. Mom was a forever girl kind of girl. When her father went away on a business trip, Mildred felt like they were having some kind of naughty holiday at home. Mom hated to cook. To stand at the stove for her meant to live her life. Go shopping, carry bags, spend half a day at the stove, then eat everything in 20 minutes, and then feed the toilet. Mom asked from the ceiling as if she were some kind of supreme judge. When Mildred and her mother were alone, it was sandwiches, coffee and ice cream, and movies, some of them better than others, without regard to bedtime. Dad would come home, and everything would go back to normal. Mom would make dinner for 3 days, the family would gather around the table, and at 10 o'clock Mildred would be sent to bed, even if tomorrow was a day off. So her mother secretly reproached herself for her weakness of character if she was so relieved to hand her daughter over to the cold, pedantic hands of Delia Gassman for 3 summer months. In the little room where Mildred was put in by her 7th cousin's grandmother, there wasn't even a door to close. There was a curtain, and in the first days of her arrival, when Mildred wanted to throw up and throw down, she had to restrain herself and behave. What a foreign word it was in her vocabulary. In an honorable manner. Afterward, however, everything was all right. Some summer her friends appeared, and then they were waiting for Mildred to arrive, and no sooner had she taken her things out of her traveling bag than Clarissa and Sami were already peering in at the window. And Delia Gassman was raising her voice. "The front garden. Flowers. Through the door, please." The girls didn't. They had preferred to stay away from the head teacher since their school days. Clarissa made a gesture with her chin towards the street. "Say, come with us," as it took a minute to kick off her shoes and change into sandals. And then a light jumped through the window. The body itself remembered last year's skill, and that was it. Summer had begun. There was internet in the village house. Slow, weak, but it worked. Show me a spot on the map that isn't covered by the World Wide Web. One time Mildred couldn't take it anymore and she jumped. She and the girls trickled into the House of Culture. It was the end of a meeting of the locals, and afterwards they were supposed to show a movie. They were just early. An aunt from the stage was talking tediously about the state of the roads. And behind the girls sat 2 grandmothers, real village old ladies gaunt in scarves. And one was telling the other what her new cell phone could do. "Wait," interrupted the second one. "Do you have Bluetooth or what?" In short, the internet was there. But after a few days it turned out that there was no time for it, because adventures on the 5th point can be found not only on the Mountain of Moses, and if you do not drown in the virtual world, the real world is extreme. Here is the lake at the edge of the village. Long, narrow, curved, half-submerged. Its left end is not that uninteresting, it is even unpleasant. Because the shores are built up, vegetable gardens run down to the water, and you are like in a shop window and constantly disturbing someone. That geese meet to swim, that men after a bath, to swim from the bridge, that deaf grandfather to fish. And you get a beating from everyone, even from... But if you go to the right end of the lake, oh, that's another matter. You have to get there along the shore, along those very little visible paths, which to a stranger's eye seem completely unnoticeable, and the thicket itself, impenetrable. But you know everything, and there is already a ravine, over which there is a bridge, like from a horror movie, at the bottom of the ravine running brook, and the bridge as if the forest built from such old, gaunt trunks and branches that every time you think, I will be the last one who will risk to cross it, undermine it, and collapse. But behind the bridge the thicket parted, and the lake lay, enclosed in precipitous banks, and no one around. The forest, looking out of the bushes, a mermaid that looks at you from the depths, although in reality, here can appear only cat scientist, and that if Vasca brought from home and tied to a tree. Delia Gassman didn't really keep Mildred in line. The rules to obey were few and simple. No running out for a walk without breakfast. Watch your appearance. Dirty clothes, wash them. Torn clothes, sew them up. After dark, go home. Though Mildred sometimes violated the last rule mercilessly. Otherwise, how could she and the girls walk along the star paths? There were plenty of fireflies in the vicinity of the village. Both Clarissa and Sami had been dismissive of them before. So what if they were bugs with glowing asses? Clarissa said. But when the ordinary road along the field, so dull and dusty by day, so dull and dusty by night, called to Mildred with a witch's light, she was utterly mesmerized. It was as if the night sky was now on every side. The stars twinkled above her head and under her feet. One by one, as if by themselves, fairy stories were born. Mildred did not admit to the girls that she had composed them herself. She said she had read them in books. Her friends listened with their mouths ajar, believing, frightened, and as they did not want to make a fool of themselves, they tried to tell Mildred something comparable about the local countryside. Near Sami began. At the other end of the field, there's the Barzer's garden. They say there used to be a house there before the revolution, where a baron lived. Nothing is left of the house, but you can go to the garden even now. But everything there has been wild for a long time. Shallow and sour. And where the river is, well, where the cape is, you, Clarissa, picked up. There's a dig. The ancient people lived there like monkeys. Archaeologists used to come there, digging in the ground. It's all broken crockery, pots and pans, as if they were always fighting with each other and throwing dishes. There's a dead man lying further away. Sami inserted. There the earth has crumbled a little and a grave has appeared. But it's not scary, it's ancient. And you can't even dig it up yet because you need some special permission. Clarissa was silent for a moment, and then she said as if she were revealing a secret. The scary ones are werewolves. Ma, come on, Mildred couldn't take it anymore. It's all understandable, the movies, Twilight. Tell me about the vampires. But Clarissa was neither embarrassed nor angry, but said even sadly, it's not me. That's what the grown-ups say. Well, yes, I know that you have hunting grounds here, and at the edge of the forest, there is a banner saying that hunting is forbidden. Just imagine, one hunter says to another, let's go, maybe we'll get lucky today and kill a couple werewolves. Sami usually giggled at every occasion, but she didn't. Clarissa began to explain, it's a shame we don't have any tall houses here to climb up and see, except for the water tower, but it's locked, and you have to get in. If you look from up high, you can see a mountain behind the forest, and behind it, no one's been going there for a long time. At first, they wouldn't let us in. Just some men in uniform stood there and wouldn't let them in. They said there was some treasure hidden there. Sami was in a hurry to say, as if there was a treasure in the mountain itself. And then either the treasure ended. What do you mean, ran out? Clarissa's voice was irritated. Or it was found and taken away, or it never existed at all. The thing is, there's a place down there where werewolves live. That's where they keep people safe from them. Because they could attack like wolves if someone alone or in pairs wandered into those parts. Mildred was tempted to give up. It was all right to lie, but don't lie too much. It's one thing when she talks about distant galaxies and aliens. It's clear fantasy. Fairy tales, that's also understandable. Things of bygone, you can even tickle your nerves. Imagine that on the eve of Ivan Kupala mermaids, lounging on the shore, bathing in the moonlight. But do not go to the forest because you don't even have ordinary wolves here, said Mildred. Why are you inventing some A? For the first time in her memory, she felt that Clarissa was offended. She was the bravest of the three of them, not afraid to swim in the river, even though it had whirlpools and eddies. She could go into the garden at night, but here, apparently, her courage was at an end. Something prevented her from crossing the line, and Mildred's careless remark poked at the sore spot. Clarissa wanted to change the subject, but she couldn't. We can get closer, she said with a challenge. We can get to Red Lake, and then I'll show you the... Mildred wasn't going to go there, and she wasn't allowed to go any farther, and she knew from Clarissa's tone that it would be a long walk. It's no big deal. Come on, let's just look. And we won't get lost. It's concrete. When you're tired, turn back and that's it. If it's hot, you can go swimming in the lake. And of animals, the worst is if you meet a wild boar. Let's go. Clarice seemed to be on fire herself, me, characterized by her ability to soften sharp corners. Again, found an option. There's plenty of strawberries. We can take some Biden jars with us. I could either make it between breakfast and lunch or between lunch and dinner. Mildred thought, already giving up. Otherwise, grandmother would make me stay home for 3 days. But no matter what they thought, it was not possible to set out until the afternoon. This morning I was captain of the potato field, complained Mildred, and it's just endless. And every bush has to be looked under the tail, weed and perch. To mother on the boat, why do people need so many potatoes, eh? The girls only giggled. They took such labor for granted. At first the road seemed very beautiful to Mildred. She had never been here before, and everything fascinated her. There was the meadow drowned in flowers, the bridge over the river where she could linger and watch the flocks of fish scurrying under the water, and the unusually picturesque withered tree on the other side of the river, which looked like the figure of a huge witch from a distance. But at the end of the second hour of the journey, my legs were tired and my impressions lacked freshness. There was indeed a concrete track under my feet, long ago laid slabs, partly buried in the ground and overgrown with grass. The road turned and again rushed forward, and on the sides was the same forest. Hadn't we had enough? Mildred was the first to ask. We've got a long way to go. Let's just rest a little. Wait, there will be a lake now. Sammy reassured her. This is the last place where people from our village go fishing. Further, no. And why is it red? Mildred asked without much interest. She was too tired. Is there any special water here? Nope. There used to be a village nearby, and it was called so. Beautiful, I mean. But the lake is just an ordinary lake. And it's not very nice to swim here. Only in one place, but the shores are too boggy. Then they saw motorcycles at the edge of the road. A sign that the fishermen were really here. Oh, let's go farther away, Clarissa suggested. They're fishing, and we'll swim. One of her grandmother's injunctions was not to swim in strange places. But it was so hot and they wanted to get into the cool water. When they came to the lake, a small lake lost in the woods. Clarissa raised her eyebrows. I haven't been here for a long time. I don't remember. Let's find this beach. Let's go. One to the left, one to the right along the shore. Mildred went to the left, not noticing that Sammy obediently stepped to the right, behind Clarissa. There were no paths here. Only the shore of the lake could serve as a landmark. Mildred walked and looked for the place where the shores were overgrown with reeds and where there would be sand. She knew from experience that here, in the silence, every sound traveled far. Either she would call the girls, or they would call her. Here, the coastal bushes parted. The shallow water opened, and the sand on the shore was white. Where? Cried Mildred. But there was absolute silence. No one answered her. That ringing silence, when it feels like you're alone in the world, it just couldn't be. Mildred knew she had not gone far. Well, 10 minutes, no more, as she wandered alone along the shore. At most, the girls had gone the same distance, but in the other direction. It's not that you can't shout to each other, you can hear each other call, but there are still fishermen. It could not be. So it was necessary to take control and calm down. And then when she and the girls would meet, all together they would laugh at the fact that the fearless girl from the city was so scared in the first minutes when she was left alone. Even impossible to get lost here. Even though there was no path, the lake shore was right there. You just had to face it. If she went to the left, she would have to go back to the right. That's all, so Mildred said to herself. But as she looked around the lake and its shore, she saw no sign that people were near. It was the same silence, the shores overgrown with reeds, and a sky that was beginning to frown. It looked like a thunderstorm was just walk, Mildred said to herself. Walk and think of nothing. And everything will end right now. If not on the girls, then on these men fishermen, I'll definitely come across. She walked on, but nothing, exactly nothing, was happening. Tired, scratched against branches and twigs, Sweaty and bruised, Mildred was ready to cry. Finally, she realized that the impossible had happened. She was lost. Mildred tried to remember the map. Several times she and the girls had looked at the satellite map on her cell phone, figuring out what was around and where else to go. It looked like the forest stretched for many kilometers, but that was only if you stood. Again, facing the lake, and on all other sides there were villages quite close to each other, to reach at least the concrete road or the river. There is no fear there. The river will sooner or later lead to another village. If not today, then tomorrow. Mildred shuddered as she imagined spending the night alone in the forest. But if there was no way out, well, maybe she would have to. There are no large animals here, only wild boars. They don't eat people. It seems there are also vipers. He and the girls almost stepped on one. They were running to the river, and it was crawling across the road. It was like a trickle of black water. Vipers are not so poisonous that they can kill you. Nothing will happen to her, Mildred. If it's too scary, you can stay awake. Just sit somewhere and wait till dawn. The thing is, she was desperately scared right now. So much so that she didn't even think about how worried her grandmother would be and what panic her parents would feel when she told them. And grandmother would tell them. For now, Mildred feared only for herself. She decided to walk until dark, and then she would see. And perhaps she should have made as much noise as possible. It would scare away the forest predators, are there lynxes here or not? And maybe attract people's attention. But how to make noise? Shouting, perhaps singing would be better. Mildred coughed and sang, and almost immediately, she didn't even realize how it happened. It was as if the spasm that had been gripping her throat until now had finally released. Her voice changed, became rich, sonorous, ringing with silver notes. Never, never had she sung like that. If it had been a large concert hall instead of a vast forest, Mildred's voice would have filled every corner of it. She sang everything. The simple songs she had learned at school, in music class, and those she had heard on television. Her own voice encouraged her and supported her and even made her a little dizzy. And then he saw it. On a small hill overgrown with hazel trees sat a wolf and listened to her intently. There was no doubt in her mind that it was a wolf. It is not true that these predators are called gray, and they also say eyes smart like a man. No, Six was not gray, but multicolored, iridescent. There you have brown and silver and almost white, and the look. He wasn't just intelligent, he was wise. Beastly wisdom, much older than humans. It must have been a scout wolf, because they usually hunt in packs. Or families, like in Mowgli. For a moment, Mildred tried to remember everything she knew about wolves, and then realized it was useless. Despair gripped her. She didn't know how to climb trees. There was no other way to escape, but there was already a man standing next to the wolf. It was a young man, maybe a few years older than Mildred. The wolf was not a werewolf, had not taken on human form. The young man put his hand on its scruff and just stood there. Maybe Mildred should have been more frightened. A meeting in the woods with a stranger could have far more terrible consequences than a fleeting acquaintance with a predator. But the girl did not think about it. She was relieved. "Oh, what are you doing here?" The young man asked in surprise. "Looking," said Mildred. "I lost my..." He thought for a few moments, then nodded. "That happens here. Are you from..." Mildred heard the name of a familiar village and nodded. "You won't make it back tonight," he said. Come, you'll spend the night at our place, and tomorrow I'll take you." "Who's your place?" Her fear was awake in her again, and the question gave it away. "We live nearby, our village. Come on, your mother will feed you." Until now, Mildred hadn't thought she was hungry. But now, and really did she have a choice? Only to trust this boy. He was about 15 or 16 years old by the looks of it. He would have been very handsome, blue-eyed, with correct features. The only thing that spoiled him was the scar across his lips. But his hair was good, golden, curly, in a lush cap. I guess he didn't like the barber shop. "Follow me," the young man said to Mildred, and so calmly went to the thicket as if the thought that he could get lost did not even cross his mind. Is it, wolf?" Mildred asked timidly. He turned around. "A couple of years ago, my father's dog ran away into the woods in the spring and apparently walked with a wolf. They wanted to drown the puppies, saying they wouldn't grow into anything good, only chickens. But I didn't let them. Now no dog can compare to him. A hunter's dream, a circo. Don't worry, he won't hurt anyone unless I tell him to. Leader followed the boy, but she walked with all her might and could not adjust to his steps. They were too flying, and the new acquaintance felt something. He stopped, waited for Mildred, and took her hand. His palm was very stiff. "Oh, and why do you say that this happens here?" The girl asked. "It's a special place," he explained. "It has happened many times before. A man goes on his way, but he comes out in the place from which he started. Or he gets lost, and God knows where he comes out." Mildred thought that she would have nothing against going back to the place from which she had set out on this crazy journey. Her grandmother's house. "Why do you come here yourself?" she asked. "If it's so dangerous here." He turned around and grinned slightly with mangled lips. "And we are local. It doesn't touch us. We're well, to put it simply, the old believers. We have a different faith. That's why we live in a special way." It started with my great-grandfather. That didn't quite understand what he was talking about, but she was much calmer now than before. She clung to the hand of her new acquaintance, and somehow it happened that now she was not afraid of the forest, with all its predators and the approaching night. Even her legs seemed to have stopped whining, only she was more and more hungry. Circo trudged ahead without looking back. "You sing well," said the young man. "I've never heard anyone sing like that before." "None of ours, only once on the radio. We can't have all that." "TV, radio? I was in town with my grandfather. I heard it there by chance." "Oh, I've never heard it before." Madrid wanted to explain that she'd never thought she had any ability before, and she wasn't very good at music lessons. But then the forest parted and the new acquaintance. Here we are." Mildred thought it was a movie. It was a tiny village, maybe a dozen or so houses, all log houses, none of them stone. There were such houses where her grandmother lived too, but many of them were abandoned, with empty windows. The villagers dismantled the abandoned huts and sometimes even burned them. Here there was not a single abandoned house. It was obvious that everyone was taken, and her new acquaintance hadn't lied to her, hadn't led her to a remote place. People lived here. The grandfather, thin, gray-bearded but sturdy, called out to them in surprise. "My, Vince, who have you brought?" "The girl has lost her way." The young man raised his voice. "I'll take her home tomorrow." He turned to his companion. What's your name?" "Mildred." Vincent had only one mother. His father died last year. The mother, a burly woman with a pleasant, good-natured face, was even more amazed when she saw Mildred. "Lord, so little and so far gone." "Well, where have you gone from home, my dear?" "She didn't go that far," Vincent explained. "She was just at the lake with her friends." Her mother was silent and nodded understandingly. She fed Mildred, and Mildred thought she had never had such delicious borscht, and the porridge with mushrooms was good too. And the tea, strange in Mildred's mind, was not even tea at all but just brewed herbs and honey, the like of which she had never tasted before. Green as an emerald. With this kind woman by her side, Mildred became quite calm. "Aunt Grace," as the owner introduced herself, then lamented that Mildred's relatives must be going crazy. The child was missing, then asked the girl not to make such distant trips or just stroked her head. "As soon as it's dawn, Vince will take you back," Aunt Grace reassured her. "I feel sorry for your grandmother today. What a night it will be for her." "Maybe she'll realize I've come to see you," Mildred suggested. "It's been a long time since anyone's been here. I think people have forgotten we live here. Either we are here or we are not." Mildred remembered her friends telling her legends about werewolves, which, of course, didn't exist. Maybe the memory that there were humans in the forest had become distorted and had given rise to these stories. "Don't tell anyone about us either," Aunt Grace said, "or the curious will start coming here, and we don't want them to." She made Mildred's bed in a separate corner behind the stove. She showed her where to wash up and brought her nightgown. Don't you ever go anywhere from here." Mildred's eyes were drooping, but curiosity still got the better of her. The girl thought that even this bed, on which she was now settled, an iron bed with a frame net, not here, in this remote village made? Why, our men come, they bring it to us when we need something. But they rarely come out. Journalists came here, it happened. Someone tipped them off. But for us, this fame is worse than a bitter radish. Leave us to live with God alone. Aunt Grace said something else, but Mildred was almost asleep. Still, she heard people still knocking at the hut. They came asking about the girl, that is, about her. Apparently, the appearance of the little guest was a big event. It seemed to Mildred that Aunt Grace touched her shoulder as soon as she closed her eyes. "It's dawning," she said. "Come on, it's time to go home." Vince was already waiting for her, sitting at the table. Aunt Grace fed them both, poured a large mug of milk, and cut some bread. Mildred thought of the few times she and her grandmother had sat like this, by candlelight, when the power went out in the village. Not only her legs, but her whole body ached from yesterday's walk, and Mildred was preparing herself for a long walk today. "Maybe all day," Zian said. "Are you eating well?" Aunt Grace asked. "Oh, it's kind of the first time I've tried it." Mildred tried to sing something and was amazed. She didn't have any special voice. I mean, just her usual squeaky voice, the kind of voice that made the music teacher wave his hand hopelessly. No sooner had Mildred thought she must be in a bad way than Aunt Grace said, "Oh, it happens. So it's a gift from above, but not forever. But at times like this," which she put her arm around Mildred and crossed her. "Well, go child, go children." That was the end of the village for her. There was no reprimand, only the tears of her mother and grandmother. Her father, who had turned black and gray that night, as if he had suffered a serious illness, and the triumph of those who were part of the search party, because they had found the girl alive, and in such a short time, Mildred was not even allowed to talk to her friends. Clarissa and Sammy looked at her guiltily from behind other people's backs, made some signs, but Mildred never managed to tell them what had happened to her. In fact, she told no one the truth. Somehow it happened that she got lost. She knew that the forests were vast. She thought she would never get out, but luckily she heard the voices of the rescuers. At night in the forest was very scary. It's good that summer nights are That's all anyone who tried to question her learned from her. A day later, Mildred was taken to town. Her frivolous mother had certainly grown up during that terrible 24 hours. She took a vacation, and until the 1st of September she never left her daughter's side, except to hold her hand. "God showed me what could happen," the unbelieving mother repeated. "Thank God everything was all right." Then school started. It was good that it was literally in the yard. Otherwise, probably, Mom would have quit to take her daughter to classes and to meet her when the lessons are over. School and English class, that was it. Mildred was not allowed to go anywhere else alone. She was allowed to bring her friends, as many as she wanted and whenever she wanted, to surf the internet even 24 hours a day, to listen to music without headphones, but only at home. Her parents took her out on weekends. Mildred didn't remember that before they went somewhere like this, the whole family, to the movies or the water park, out of town for a picnic or to a big shopping mall. The three of them went on vacation together now. And for the remaining 2 summer months, Mildred was sent to camp, where the teachers kept an eye on their charges and counted them by their heads. All this ended when Mildred graduated from high school and entered the institute. She liked English, she wanted to study the language, and she could not imagine any other way for herself. Her parents had to realize that the former control over her was the girl was preparing for exhausting explanations with her mother, for attempts to appeal to reason, but something happened that she hadn't expected. Her father had left the family. It was so trivial. He met a young woman, almost the same age as his daughter, and the sober, punctual, ultra-responsible father who had been the captain of their family ship all these years had abandoned the vessel to the waves. Mildred expected it to be a terrible blow to her mother. She would become depressed, perhaps even go into bed, but she could not suppose that her mother, determined to prove everything to everybody, would marry within a year. Her father had left the apartment to his ex-wife and daughter. Her mother's new boyfriend had moved in with them, and Mildred felt superfluous. She liked studying very much. She was one of the best in the course. She realized at the time of studenthood, this is a prolonged childhood. Still, she dreamed of the time when she would start working, and immediately, on her first paycheck, she would rent an apartment, even the smallest, simplest. But from that day on, her own life would begin as she saw it. However, even here, everything did not go according to Mildred's scenario. First of all, she saw herself as a translator of fiction, but she couldn't find such a place. But where she was willingly taken, it is in school. a teacher of English. The constant staff turnover in pedagogy led to the fact that the director met a girl with no experience almost with open arms. But Mildred only lasted 6 months. As a subject teacher, she was good. The boys could learn a lot from her. But when it came to discipline, she couldn't bring the students to order. They could do anything but English in class. Crouched down. The boys ran between the rows, did their math homework, ate the ice cream they raced to the kiosk for at recess, and talked to each other without lowering their voices. When Mildred returned home, her head was buzzing and tears came to her eyes from her own helplessness. Her salary was so small that it was clear that if she rented an apartment, she would have to starve because she had no strength for a part-time job. So when Mildred saw the ad, she thought she was dreaming. A well-to-do family was looking for an English teacher for a boy of 10. Living in the countryside, of course, housing was provided, decent conditions, including food. The ad was already 3 days old, and Mildred had no doubt she was late. Still, she sent an email since the advertiser preferred messages rather than calls. Beard wasn't hoping for anything. She had almost no seniority, and she didn't give the impression of being too serious. A short, thin girl of 24, painfully shy and insecure. She was all the more startled when the bell rang and a man's voice invited her to go for an interview. Mildred squeaked. "Oh, why should she? You can start work and then we'll see." "No, just like that. You don't know anything about me." Darling, these days, thanks to the internet, you can find out a lot about a person. So you're welcome to come, unless you've changed your mind. Mildred's new master. How strange it was to hear the word master, probably employer was better, was called Aaron Jaeger. For the first time, the girl decided to go without her things, and without saying anything at home. She felt that her mother would awaken her old fears, and she would not let her go. Mildred herself would hardly have found this place if it hadn't been for the cab driver with his navigator. And he'd never been here before. Winter forest, narrow road. It was not far from the village where Mildred used to spend her summers, but up. "Wow," said the cab driver when they finally reached the village. "They've built a real castle." It was a very beautiful house, not unlike the mansions of the new Russians. They seemed to boast of their wealth, no matter that taste was often sacrificed. This house, on the other hand, looked as if it had stepped out of the pages of a fairy tale about the Middle Ages. It wasn't that big, but it breathed harmony. Everything was in place. The turrets, the stained glass windows, the small balconies, no bigger than swallows' nests. And even the fence, which resembled metal lace topped with sharp peaks. "Wait for me, please," said Mildred to the taxi driver. I won't be long, I guess. I can't get out of here alone." "Wait, I'll pay." She was sure that, having seen her with her own eyes, Aaron Lovovich would, of course, refuse her immediately. And she also had no doubt that in such a large house there were, of course, servants. Probably these women were better dressed than herself, and they would look at her with contempt. She was opened by an elderly man with an unassuming, unrecognizable face. "Oh, I know," he said. When Mildred tried to explain who she was, "You are expected. Come along." Inside, everything was decorated in the same old-fashioned way. She wanted to go up the stairs to see what the castle was like on the upper floors. But she was led down a hall, and a servant opened a heavy oak door. It was a study, with bookshelves to the ceiling, a massive desk on which, however, stood something very far from antique, a laptop computer. And then a man rose from behind the desk, and Mildred forgot all about it. "Why, he looks like a young devil," flashed through her mind. If devils can be young, devilish character or not. There was something of Mephistopheles about him, very tall and very thin, all angular of some sort. The man greeted them with a lush black hair curled in fine, chemical curls, jagged, expressive eyebrows, and light green eyes so bright it was as if he wore lenses, a black suit, and a smile from ear to ear. Aaron Jaeger was good-looking, but it was the beauty of an engraving. No softness, just sharp edges. Here you are," he said. "I'm glad." He shook both of Mildred's hands and seemed slow to release them. The servant was no longer in the study. I wanted to talk about work." She reminded him hurriedly, trying to make the awkward situation end sooner. He released her hands at last, but kept smiling. "I'll introduce you to the boy now. Have I already told you that he is ill?" "No, cerebral palsy, as they say." "Cerebral palsy." His ex-wife left him to me, and I didn't want Vivian to suffer in an institution. So he'll get everything he needs at home. Does he have other teachers? Mildred felt the ground beneath her feet, and Jaeger shook his head. One at a time. I don't want to overload him. The boy is weak, you'll see. Last year he took literature, this year English, and so on. Come on, I'll show you around, including your room. They're waiting for me. Mildred did not say that it was only a cab. She wanted to leave herself an escape route. I have to come back today to get my things. Aaron Jaeger raised his eyebrow. Good. Let it be just a short tour then. I'll show you the apprentice first. That's when they finally climbed the stairs. And Mildred thought that Aaron Jaeger could easily walk 3 steps. Please, the master opened the door for her, as the servant had done before. Mildred thought at first that there was no one in the spacious, bright room. An invalid's chair by the table, with its back to the door. Then she caught sight of a pale. Aaron Jaeger turned the chair around in one graceful, dancing movement, and Mildred saw a boy who was not even 10, but 7 years old. Round, ugly glasses, a pale, almost transparent face, and a detached look. The child looked through Mildred and did not react when Aaron Jaeger noisily introduced him to the girl and her to her future pupil. True, the boy nodded politely so that hardly anyone could reproach him for anything. But Mildred had to take the initiative. Do you want to study English? She asked the boy affectionately, putting her hand on his shoulder, and she felt that sharp shoulder shudder under his hand. And again that indifferent, polite nod. I can say English, or Chinese, or Synchrofasatron, and of course I can't help showing you to your room. Aaron Jaeger walked in front of her, back to front, still smiling with his 32 teeth. Please, never had Mildred thought she would be living in a tower. In a small, almost circular room, where all day long the sun went from one window to another, and at night the same route was taken by the month. The bed, even from afar, seemed soft and very comfortable, and how glorious it would be to read in that ancient armchair, sitting by the window. Well, no one will disturb you here. Aaron Jaeger was glad as a boy when Mildred said she would move in tomorrow. In fact, for minutes he seemed younger than his little son. At any rate, there was much more emotion and spontaneity in him. Mildred kept her word. When she returned home, she had been packing all evening. The distances were quite long, and if she had forgotten something, it would not be easy to drive to get it. Then she called her mom and told her she had started a new job. She'd be living in the country. And now, if they decided to meet, they would have to make arrangements in advance. Mom, with her usual curiosity, tried to find out all the details, but Mildred could not tell her much yet. A sick boy, small, sweet, whom she would teach. A salary far above what she had gotten at her old. Is this boy's father married? Mom asked, hitting the mark, as always. You registers. So if the man is nice and rich, don't waste your time. Try to glue him together, her mother advised, completely ignoring the fact that Mildred had no experience in gluing. As she fell asleep, she thought about how to show herself at the new place with the best side and what methodology to teach English to the boy, whose strength seems to be enough only to live a little. In the first few weeks of work, Mildred was still surprised at Vivian's behavior. He seemed to regard lessons as an unpleasant chore that could not be avoided. He had no special aptitude for language, but he studied faithfully everything Mildred assigned him. And if he had been an ordinary schoolboy, he would have earned a solid B. He did not try to distract the teacher. Didn't make small talk with her. He answered the questions asked, and that was all. Sometimes Mildred herself, on her own initiative, tried to ask him about his father, about his mother, but received meager one-word answers. The boy did not seem to long for his mother, though she had left the family not long ago. Nor did he seem to be happy about his father, though Aaron Jaeger dropped by a couple of times during classes. And all the furnishings around spoke of how he spoiled his son. Expensive furniture, specially adapted for the disabled, toys that Mildred had never seen in stores. Probably they were sent from abroad, but Vivian was completely indifferent to these luxuries. Not once did Mildred catch him playing. The same could not be said of his father. Indifference did not apply to Aaron Jaeger. He was a lump of energy and emotion. At first, Mildred thought that in his house she would fall into the category of servants, but the owner behaved with her more like a guest They dined and dined together, with a large dining room, and Aaron Jaeger always entertained Mildred, most often with stories of his travels. He had traveled all over the world, paying particular attention to Southeast Asia with its exotic tradition, and he was an excellent storyteller. A real artist. Mildred tried to talk to Vivian, to ask him about his travels, but the boy only shrugged his shoulders. He doesn't take me anywhere. Vivian rarely even said the word father. Mildred was getting more and more accustomed to Aaron Jaeger and looked forward to meeting him at the table. They all ate breakfast separately. More often than not, Mildred came down to the kitchen while Pete, the servant who had opened the door for her, was gathering breakfast for the boy on a tray. It was always the same: a mug of oatmeal on a white plate, an egg in a special silver shot glass, and apple juice. Mildred poured herself a strong cup of coffee, took a cookie from the vase, and went back up to her tower to enjoy it all. And her room, well, pure Middle Ages, like in a museum. And the first rays of sunlight that lay on the floorboards, and the boundless forest that stretched around the castle, and excellent coffee, which not only made her heart beat faster, but seemed to grow wings behind her back. Then Mildred tutored the boy. She showed him cartoons or simple children's movies in English, translating them briefly, and trying to make him understand the characters. Often by lunchtime, Aaron Jaeger was free, and sometimes Mildred did not even notice that she was eating, engrossed in conversation with him. It had been a long time since she had felt that another person was so interested in her, unless it had been her parents when she was a child. But that had been different, and more often in the evening, Aaron Jaeger would ask her out. It meant that they would go by car far away, to the city. Mildred had never been to those famous restaurants before. What was the point of going there alone? And it was very expensive. Had never sat in the best seats in the theater. She realized that the master should not have such relations with his son's teacher, that Aaron Jaeger was openly courting her, and consoled herself with her mother's admonition, "Don't be a fool, glue him together." It seemed to be the first time she'd ever done it, and Mildred was getting uncomfortable with Vivian. Perhaps the boy would have to explain sooner or later that she and his father had a special relationship. Somehow he would react to that. Mildred had dreamt of the young man who lived in the woods from time to time. She had never been so at ease with anyone as with him, as if nothing bad could happen to her in his presence. Now Vince came to her in her dreams less and less often compared to Aaron Jaeger. Everyone else seemed surprisingly bland. It would be boring to be around them. When Aaron Jaeger proposed to her, Mildred had thought she had said yes to him a long time ago. As it turned out, it was her turn to be the first to tell Vivian, as well as the fact that after the wedding, a very modest family affair, they would go on a trip. The two of them, of course, Aaron had told her yesterday. Perhaps he thought the boy's presence would be a burden to her. Mildred worried how Vivian would take it, but the boy only fluttered his long eyelashes. He averted his eyes immediately, as if he didn't want the teacher to read anything in his gaze. He remained silent for a moment, and then said, quite unexpectedly, to her, Has he shown you his collection yet?" Mildred was so surprised that Vivian had spoken to her on his own initiative that the meaning of the phrase came to her a little later. "Oh, collection? No, what are you talking about?" He jerked his chin, showing that he did not want to continue the conversation on this subject, and began to read the English words again, clearly, audibly, but without any expression, purely mechanically. It seemed that the foreign language was still as foreign to him as ever, in spite of Mildred's best efforts. Neither Aaron Jaeger nor his chosen one wanted to organize anything like a modern wedding, with a restaurant, guests, and forgive me, a toastmaster. Mildred even informed her parents that she was married after the fact. As a wedding present, Aaron gave her a very beautiful lace dress, which, as Mildred suspected, was unthinkably expensive. They were married at the registry office in the presence of a couple of his friends, whom Mildred saw for the first time that day. One of these friends drove the newlyweds to the airport. They spent 2 weeks in the Seychelles, and Mildred, who had never traveled abroad until then, was utterly enchanted. And the islands, some of which remained uninhabited, and the friendliness of the locals, with whom she easily found a common language, and the cuisine. She had never tasted such outlandish dishes, and what to say? Her love as she thought that for the first time in her life really loved. One thing that surprised her was that in these 2 weeks, Erin had never once thought of her son. Mildred herself thought of the boy much more often. She browsed the local stores for souvenirs that might appeal to Vivian. She worried about whether Pete was taking good care of him, whether the servant would know what to do if the boy got worse. She even called Vivian, surprising her husband. But when she heard the boy's calm, polite, and cold tone, just as she always did, she called herself a fool and abandoned thoughts of her ward for the time being. She didn't want to go back terribly. It was as if there had been one life perfectly fairy tale-like on the islands, and the other seemed like a dream. Did crowded cities and cold weather still exist? The departure seemed to Mildred like the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise. She was comforted by the fact that the castle was now her home, and that in a sense the prose of her days was when they returned. Mildred carried a huge bag of presents to Vivian. She really missed the boy. She wanted to hug him, ruffle his hair, and she told herself it was a good thing the child was becoming her own. But the boy didn't seem to have any intention of changing his attitude toward her. He thanked Mildred politely, but was in no hurry to get the boxes and bags. It was like he didn't care. "Oh, are you feeling all right?" he asked anxiously. It seemed to her that the child had lost even more weight and turned pale. And she decided to tell Erin something should be thought of for Vivian as well. Maybe some kind of sanatorium, even in another country. For that matter, I'd have to find out. There must be some. Like summer camps, but for kids with special needs. You can't raise a boy so he can't socialize with his peers. But that evening, just as she was about to start this conversation, her husband turned to her. "I would like to show you something very dear to me." And Mildred was frankly surprised. She thought she had seen everything in the castle already. And at the same time, she involuntarily remembered Vivian's phrase. "Has he shown you his collection before?" "What?" she asked with a smile. "Let's go." He took her hand and lifted her from the table in one strong movement, and drew her after him with the eagerness of a child who wants to show her something. The most beautiful thing in his opinion. They walked to the wing of the castle where Mildred had hitherto been least often seen. But the smile still remained on her lips. She was preparing herself for anything. A collection. But what could he collect? Such an unusual man. He'd do it, maybe gems or even meteorites, wine, shells, anything. This corridor seemed quite short, and there was only one door in it. This time Erin didn't bother to let it go through. He unlocked the lock, stepped into the room first, turned on the light, and only then said to Mildred, "Come in." It took her a moment to realize what she was seeing. When she did not rush away because her feet were stuck to the floor. At first she thought the room had glass walls. But no, they were terrariums, floor to ceiling, standing side by side. And they were all brightly lit now, and inside, it didn't even seem like the spawn of nightmares. She'd never had such terrible dreams. Huge spiders of all colors lived their lives here. The movements of their legs so fast, so elusive. Black, glossy, shiny, with patterns on their backs, and spiders whose legs were like bones stripped of flesh, and furry monsters that seemed, but it was impossible, to stare right at her. And snakes too, of all colors and sizes in such close proximity that the sheen of their scales hypnotized Mildred. Even a cobra seemed to be there, just a hand's reach away, and some other insects too. Strange ones she'd never seen before. Erin's smile would have outshone the sun if he hadn't looked like one of his pets. That huge spider. She'd never thought of such a comparison before. "I have the most dangerous creatures on the planet here," he informed her, glowering, and not noticing that Mildred was paralyzed with terror. He continued almost enthusiastically. Yes, the cobra, the king cobra. After its bite without antidote, 60% of people die. It can even kill an elephant. And this one's even better. Look how good Tipan McCoy is. It'll offer a whole cocktail of paralysis and death. There's no more poisonous creature. Spiders, now that's just the Black Widow. Its bite is not to be feared except for children and the elderly. For them, it can be fatal. Another thing is the traveler spider. That's the one that'll give you paralysis, and this one's a real cutie. You can hold it in your hands. And grabbed a huge spider covered in bright blue hairs out of the terrarium. The last thing Mildred thought before consciousness left her was, "I want to die before this thing touches." Mildred didn't think she could cry so much. Desperate sobs are like a thunderstorm. They come and they pass. And she sat there, trying to breathe inaudibly, not to sob, and the tears kept pouring. She could only cry. What else could she do? Now the scandal she had tried to make seemed ridiculous to her. She had never been able to swear before, and now she tried it. To her misfortune, "I can't live with these things in the same house," she said to her husband, letting him know it was a final ultimatum. And he just smiled at her like a child. "You see how far away they are? How securely locked up? You won't see them again if you don't want to. And I've never had much luck in my life. I've never met a woman who wasn't afraid of spiders. It's not because you locked them up tight. It's that gun that hangs on the wall that's bound to go off someday, once every 100 years, but you forget to lock the door and someone will escape. That's no more likely than one of us getting killed by lightning." But Mildred, who had never fainted before in her life, could not forget what she had seen. Those countless moving paws whose movements she could not foresee, those cold, fixed eyes, those rustles. "I can't live here," she said, more convinced of this than of anything else in the world. "Either move your collection to some other place, or I'll leave here." "But my dear, that's impossible," he said curtly, and at the same time with a force that did not yield to her protest. Mildred did not even bother to ask why. One thing she realized was that he valued his collection as much as, and probably more than, she did. "Then I'll call my father and ask him to pick me up." Mildred mentioned her father unconsciously. At that moment it seemed to her that she had no other people left but her parents. And wouldn't she ask her mother? She seldom disturbed her father, but now it was worthwhile. He would be able to talk to her husband, man to man. "I'll call," she repeated, and only smiled radiantly. But he thought she saw a cold, sparkling madness in his. The phone was out of place. Not in her purse, not under the pillow where she'd put it at night, not in the bathroom. Mildred searched the whole room, realizing more and more clearly that she would never find it. She wanted to talk to her husband immediately, but she was afraid to look for him. What if she saw the door to the east wing ajar? What if he came out of there with one of his favorite pets in his arm? He must be of the same blood as them, and not afraid to take them in his arms. The rage that was flooding her soul was looking for an outlet. So a woman who hates the drunkenness of her husband, once again seeing him in a hangover, ready to attack him. But she said, "Wait, now it is useless to talk to him. When he sobers," and Mildred now wanted to say that she would not stay here a minute, that she herself will file for divorce. But the silence in the house told, "Wait. Wait till he comes to you himself." She walked up and down the stairs and down the hallways until at last she saw her husband in the study. You would have thought he had been working on his laptop for a long time. He seemed completely absorbed in what he was writing, but Mildred knew he hadn't been here a quarter of an hour ago. "Where's my cell phone?" she asked from the doorway. "Don't tell me you didn't take it." Suddenly he chuckled, as if he were playing an extremely funny joke, a practical joke. He giggled and couldn't stop, and she suddenly realized how dependent she was on him. "That's okay if need be. She'll walk away." Aaron could barely get it out. "Busling has your phone." He decided to call too. "Who has it?" She was stunned. "Boomslang. That's the snake I brought back from the Seychelles. You didn't even notice." And no one noticed even on the airplane. "Oh, there are ways. You can't imagine how beautiful it is. It's got these big green eyes that no human being can match, and she's so sly. All the locals know, and I know, that its poison is deadly. Only 3 milligrams is enough. There was no escape from this snake before, and the antidote is only now available. But this sly one, my husband was choking with laughter. It can grab you with a dry bite. That is, just prick you with its teeth, without injecting me. DUNU a rush, go crazy, demand serum and blood transfusion, although you really nothing threatening. Conversely, if the snake bites for real, it could be hours before you feel symptoms. Your blood vessels will already be destroyed, and then stroke and death. Also, God forbid you mistake a baby boomslang for a juvenile. The former is harmless, whereas the latter, boom, and that's it. He will guard your cell phone very well, I assure you, and you won't. Try to take it away. That sly little thing is so possessive. What falls to her is gone." Put her hands over her ears. It seemed to her that she would go mad at the mere sound of that voice, in which there was no human intonation left, only to leave immediately, even if she didn't take anything with her to run or to crawl, but to leave. But Aaron had not finished his game yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something. First, he showed a clenched fist. Then he opened it. In the palm of his hand was and the door is locked. He almost sang out, enjoying the fact that everything had succeeded. But Mildred began. "And you mustn't spite me," he said, suddenly serious, "or I'm afraid one of my pets will bite you. And then you'll be hovering around me like a bird to get me to give you the cure." "Oh, I'd rather die," Mildred promised. Did she think that the only person she would be able to talk to here would be the little boy who had been so annoyed by her presence? When she came to Vivian and sat down in a chair beside him, utterly murdered, crying, and not even trying to make conversation about English, the boy was drawing. For a minute, they were both silent. Then he said, without turning his head, "Oh, I see, he showed you his collection. How do you live here?" Mildred asked suddenly to herself, "I don't know how I can sleep in this house now. I'll feel as if someone were climbing on the blanket, getting close to my face." Vivian colored in his drawing of the sky, pressing hard on the blue crayon. "Oh, you'll get used to it," he said at last. Sipri shook her head, which obviously meant no. Then she asked, "Aren't you afraid of them at all?" "Oh, look at my door." It was the first time she'd noticed this self-evidently internet detail. It was only when she looked more closely that she noticed that the door, together with the jamb, represented something special. Mildred went over and closed it. "All right." And there was a threshold on the floor. Not even a How did he agree to put one of those in for you? She pondered aloud, not realizing that she was calling her husband he as if he were a stranger. It's just that he knows that if he wants to, he'll bring anyone here himself. Outwardly, Vivian's voice remained as calm. "Does he take them in his hands?" "He has these gloves, like metal gloves, like some kind of flexible alloy. I don't know, elbow high. And yeah, he takes them." "Why?" Mildred could barely say it, too scared to know the answer. Vivian looked up at her. "He loves them, it seems. But if he wants to punish someone, he'll introduce that person to his friends more closely. You won't die. He has antidotes for all the bites. The most important thing is not to show you're scared. I was scared at first, but then I don't care anymore. It happens, though, that you suffer for a while. You get a headache and it makes you sick. My God, how can you do this to me? My own son." "He's not my father," Vivian said, without any emotion. "I don't know how many times he married. But my mom, it was, well, a woman with a child. And where is she now?" The boy shrugged. "He told me my mom didn't like it here, and she really wanted to leave. He let her go, but he left me to make sure she didn't blab about the whole thing anywhere. See how well she listened to me. He said she never came after you. But I don't think my mom would have left me. So I don't know if she's alive or not. Why did he leave me? He doesn't have kids. Maybe he wants an heir, at least one like me. Or maybe I'm just a lab rat, or maybe he just wanted to invite his next victim. You were hired for me." Bird cried until late that night, and she didn't know where to spend the night. Now she could not set foot in her luxurious bedroom unless she made a great effort. Not that she was afraid her husband would come to her, cradling some deadly snake as gently as a child. She had already associated him herself with one of the exhibits in his collection. The scariest exhibit of all. She wanted more than anything to lie in the same room as Vivian, at least on the doorstep, but she knew that wasn't an option. For one thing, her husband had keys to all the doors. He could open any of them. Secondly, he could punish the boy for being too frank. What did Vivian want? As it was, the lad was barely warm. In the end, she lay down at her place, wrapped herself in a blanket with her head wrapped up, and pretended to be asleep. The blanket was so thick that it might not be bitten. It was better to be stuffy. Mildred heard her husband come in and settle himself at the other end of the bed. She lay holding her breath until he fell asleep. But then she couldn't sleep either. She pondered her escape options. It was clear the front door was locked. The bars on the windows had not pleased her at first, but her husband had told her, "Darling, there have been cases of thieves breaking into the house before. Nothing serious, just some scum who just want to take the first thing they see and drink it or trade it for dope. Besides, I'm away a lot. And if I put an alarm system on, they'll be here before they react. Believe me, you'll soon stop noticing those bars." She did. But now the castle was finally starting to feel like a prison. The only thing she realized was that it was useless to make scandals and demand something from this madman. Most likely, he would decide to punish her, and she wouldn't stand for it. She just won't, that's all. She shuddered at the thought of what she might be threatened with. "Vivian," she asked the boy the next day, "have you tried running away from here?" He wheeled around in his wheelchair in front of her, back and forth a little, but it was enough for her to realize what a fool she was. "And if you do succeed," he said, "he'll destroy me first. He's afraid you'll bring the police here. They'll find me." "But have you even thought about it?" she asked, almost desperately. Vivian was silent. Later, Mildred realized that he was considering whether to reveal to her the plan he had been hatching, which was his only hope of salvation. A plan he couldn't carry out without help. Vivian looked at Mildred with the eyes of an old man and felt sorry for her. "There's a back door," he said, "but only Pete uses it. Because that door opens and there's a bridge and a river. Pete likes to fish, but he's only got an inflatable boat. But you can't get to the oars. The boat's over there on the dock, and he's got the oars. That's okay. The river has a fast current. It'll carry him far without oars. And by the time they grab him, they say there are people downstream. Someone will notice. I don't know how to get there from here, only to move the horses. He won't reach us in the next world." "Oh, shall we try it?" Mildred asked in a low voice. Now she was ready to overestimate her husband, and to think that in every corner of the castle they were being watched and overheard. Vivian looked past her into the window, which was barred by a grate. Mildred suddenly realized how small and weak he was. Take his hand. There is almost no strength in it. And yet he had not yet given up hope of outwitting this madman. And Mildred also knew now that she could not leave here alone, and might have thought her resigned, just withdrawn. Her wife no longer objected to him, nor did she even speak to him herself, only answered his questions, and she avoided his company at all costs. Now he often found her with a book or needlework in the farthest corner of the house, where she sat until she had to give lessons to Vivian, or sit at the table, or take her place in the bedroom. He couldn't imagine how monstrous his touch was to her now. Or perhaps on the contrary, he imagined it and enjoyed it. So blissful was he in showing others his pets and reading the horror and disgust on their faces. Mildred sometimes thought with bitter humor that maybe karma would work, and Aaron's next wife would be a female herpetologist who would deal with his deadly menagerie and she also knew that the hour of escape was approaching, and that she and the boy would have only one chance to get out of here free. Only 2 days left, she thought, but from the very beginning things did not go as she had envisioned. Pete really was a fishing enthusiast. Perhaps there was no other entertainment for him here. There was plenty of work to do, and Aaron Jaeger didn't want any other servants. Only a few times a year, the workers came to tidy up the garden and clean the house. Everywhere except that very wing, there were only 2 keys to the door to the little underworld, as Mildred had dubbed it, the master and his servant. They could not fall into any other hands. Still, in summer, almost every day, and in winter, when there was no frost, Pete went to the river to meditate for an hour or 2 with a fishing rod. Not once did any fish he caught appear on the table, and there was nothing worthy of attention in the little river for small fish, cat's delight. Now Mildred kept her eyes on the servant, and was convinced that Vivian had indeed pointed out to her the only way of escape. The main entrance was clearly visible from any window, and the gate was locked, and the fence, topped with metal spikes, wasn't much of an escape route. The kitchen was another matter. Apparently, it never occurred to any of the unwilling prisoners of the castle to get to this semi-cellar and then unlock the inconspicuous door and climb up the ladder. There was almost no shore on this side, but there was a boardwalk, and the inflatable boat was always waiting for its owner. Mildred knew that on the last day of the month, Pete got a day off. He would leave for town late the night before and return 24 hours later. Who he was visiting, who was waiting for him. So unsociable, so self-absorbed, God only knew. So an escape could only be planned for that time. Pete didn't lock the kitchen and left the food he had prepared for the owners in the refrigerator. It was Mildred's job to do the housekeeping. There were times when she stayed up until nearly midnight washing dishes and putting things in order. When she came back upstairs, her husband was asleep. If things had gone on as before, Mildred and Vivian would have escaped. They wouldn't have been searched for until morning. What search at night? They'd be long gone by then. "Oh, can you come downstairs?" Mildred asked the boy. "Can you get to the kitchen?" "Oh, if I'd known it was going to burn out, I'd have crawled down on my hands and knees," said the boy. To keep the noise down, Mildred thought, "Or maybe it would be better if I came up behind you and carried you in my arms. You're light, and if all of a sudden, say you wanted to sit with me in the kitchen while I clean up, chat, drink tea." Vivian sighed so heavily that his breath was more like a spasm. On the evening of the evening in question, it looked as if his fate would be decided, whether he lived or not. And he knew it. For the remaining couple of days, Mildred lived with bated breath. She made no objection to her husband and behaved like a mute shadow. Only once did her eyes show confusion. When setting the table, Pete wondered whether he should take a day off this time. "Oh, well, I'll go," he finally decided. "My friend's been asking me to visit him for a long time." This meant that tomorrow Mildred would take Pete's place. And she turned to her husband with the most innocent voice. "Perhaps you would like me to prepare something special," and made a sign with his hand that it was not worth the trouble. He had no doubt that the servant had made sure that the dishes were ready long ago and were just waiting to be served. Pete glanced at his watch. "Oh, it would be good for me to leave early today," he said anxiously. "The weather is getting worse." Oh, Mildred tried to give her voice a careless tone. "I'll clean and wash everything myself." And in confirmation of her words, she began to collect dirty plates in a few minutes. She caught her husband's attentive gaze and shrugged her shoulders. After Pete left, Mildred spent a long time in the kitchen, looking for new jobs. She was scrubbing the spotlessly clean stove for the 10th time or rearranging the jars and boxes in the cupboard. And looked in, and she told him, "I've got a lot more to do here. Lie down, don't wait for me." She herself decided to go after Vivian after midnight, because at that time her husband was already asleep. But what a bad night it had been. Even here in the kitchen, through the thick walls and double frames, she could hear the rain pounding outside. Then Mildred thought with horror that the boat might not be there. What owner would leave it on the shore in such bad weather? The venture seemed to her quite mad. What if she went out now and looked? There was a door. The door to the outside might be locked. Mildred felt a chill. She was not a burglar. She could not open the lock with a stiletto, and it was unlikely to be broken. Everything was so securely made here. But the lock yielded obediently when she grasped it. But what was happening outside? It was raining. Mildred ducked and ran to the dock and caught her breath when she saw the boat hidden under the shade.
Yet even escape was half the battle. Would she and the boy, who almost 100% likely couldn't swim, get to the nearest place where people lived? "I don't care," Mildred said to herself. "If not to the village, at least to the shore. I'll carry him on my hands from here."
She came back, wet as a mouse, and heard her husband's voice. "Finish up. It's late." "Oh, don't wait for me." "Finish it," he repeated with pressure. "God, where did you get so wet?" He was already on the threshold, and Mildred had no choice but to make frantic excuses. "I love a big thunderstorm. I couldn't resist. I wanted to have a look." He only shook his head and, taking her hand, led her into the bedroom. Mildred consoled herself with the fact that she had not made him so angry that he had resorted to punishment. And then she lay in bed beside him, listening to the big clock chiming softly, measuring half an hour, an hour. It was now the second hour of the night, and the storm seemed to be subsiding. Mildred knew that Vivian was waiting for her. He had not gone to bed. They had agreed, waiting, and he didn't know what was wrong, why she wasn't coming. Several times Mildred tried to get up, but her husband held her arm unconsciously in her sleep, and she was afraid to pull harder to wake him. It was already beginning to get light when she managed to get out of the bedroom. She moved as silently as a spirit. As she was in her nightgown, she flew upstairs, grabbed the sleepy boy in her arms, and started downstairs. Sneaking almost without breathing, she reached the kitchen, opened the door. The rain was almost gone, but it was freezing cold, and she had nothing to wrap the boy in. And Mildred said to herself again, "I don't care. Even if we get sick, we'll be cured." Just to get out, just to get out. She had never been in a boat before in her life, never had to. And now she lowered the boy into it. "Make yourself as comfortable as you can," she said to him. Now perhaps she had to sit down herself. Or not. First push the boat away from the shore and then get into it. What if it was deep? What if this tiny little boat, like a toy ship, is swept up by the current? Mildred hesitated for a few moments, not knowing what to do, and then she saw Vivian's upturned face and his look of horror. She turned around, letting go the edge of the boat. Her husband was standing behind her back, staring there past her at the boy. Surely he was sure his wife would never leave him again. And here's the bastard. And then, with a last hopeless and desperate movement, she pushed the boat, falling into the water so that the river covered her head for a few moments, and pulled her out with a single tug. He raked the shirt down her back so that the wet straps dug painfully into her shoulders. He drove Mildred in front of him in jerks, ignoring the fact that she was stumbling, ready to fall at any moment. She realized that this was almost certainly the end of it for her now, but she was even more afraid for the boy. The last moment she'd seen him, the boat had been swept out of the middle of the river, and Vivian really couldn't swim. It was a small room, maybe 5 or 6 feet. There were no windows, so it wasn't really a room. It was a closet painted a dark red color, and pushed Mildred inside with such force that she fell to the floor. And she didn't even try to get up, huddled in a corner, covering her face with her hands. She was so scared she felt like she was going to throw up. Did you want him to drown? It struck her that her husband's voice remained as smooth and calm as ever. He seemed to have no doubt that nothing irreparable had happened. Mildred was entirely in his power, and Vivian, what of Vivian? The boy was unknown in the neighborhood. The fact that he was going to die was a free hand for this man. He wouldn't have to deal with it himself. And the child's death would never be linked to him. Mildred sobbed hysterically, sobbing, so it had all failed. She hadn't gotten out of the trap herself, and she'd killed the boy who trusted her. She heard the metal door slam shut. God knows how long she'll be in that closet. Maybe for the rest of her life. Her parents would remember her, of course. The first one must be her mom. But that may still be a very, very long time from now. Her folks think she's happily married. So much so that she's forgotten about them, doesn't even call, and they don't want to bother her. So they won't realize until it's too late. She heard footsteps approaching and froze. The door had opened. Mildred caught herself that her vision had become somehow peculiar. She did not see the whole picture. All she saw were hands shining with a metallic luster. A snake wriggled in each one. They were small, these snakes, and each one her husband looked at with love. They were truly of the same blood as him, and lowered his pets to the floor, very gently, as if he were dropping off children. Mildred could not make a sound out of horror. Even if she had tried, it would not have worked. She got up and stood huddled in the corner, not realizing what she looked like from the outside. Her mouth hanging open, her eyes bulging out of their orbits, and smiled, closed the door, and flicked the light switch. The room went dark. The darkness was absolute. The car pulled into a small village, one of those villages that at best gets a bus once a day. That's why the black, obviously expensive Jeep attracted the attention of all the inhabitants who happened to see it. The car stopped near the church. The man behind the wheel and the woman next to him sat silently for some time. The man's appearance was memorable. Curly black hair with light graying, a narrow and somehow long face, light green eyes under moving eyebrows. The woman was wearing dark glasses. She looked as if she had been seriously ill. "I guess you are dear to me after all," said the man. "You see, I let you go alive. What should I have entered your place 10 minutes later? Or just stand over you without doing anything?" The woman didn't utter a word. Her face remained as still as ever. "All right, go," the man allowed with a sigh. "You will walk 20 steps, and there they are, beggars sitting. You can join them. Or a kind person will find a kind person and call your parents to pick you up. But remember, if you say a word about me, you'll sign your sentence. No one can prove that what happened to you is my doing. I'll prove that you're crazy and obsessive compulsive, and after that, I promise you, either you or someone close to you will meet a snake somewhere. A pretty little snake that can send you to the grave faster than a lightning strike. Maybe one of you will find one under your pillow, or in your mailbox when you reach for the newspaper, or just in your shoe. Oh, snakes can get in anywhere. And to keep them away from you, all you have to do is keep quiet." The woman continued to stare in front of her. The man bent over, opened the door on her side. "Go ahead," he said. She got out of the car awkwardly. And then he had to get out too, taking her by the shoulders and giving her a little push, pointing in the direction. That way, the woman walked with an uncertain, stumbling step. As she approached the beggars sitting at the temple entrance, the man started the motor and drove off.
Mildred knew that the darkness would stay with her forever. The antidote had kept her alive, but not her sight. Apparently something was irreversibly damaged in her until a few weeks ago, when she realized she was still alive. She had cursed fate and wondered how she could get her hands on herself. Because as a blind prisoner, her existence would be far worse than death.
Why Erin had decided to let her go, she did not know. In general, Mildred felt like Lazarus, the one who had been to the other world and returned. Drunk or something. She heard voices.
Mildred realized why people thought so. It was because of her wobbly, unsteady gait.
Give happy holidays, just in case. Someone dragged on, thinking that she might have. Mildred finally made it, grasped the church fence with both hands. Then she turned around. There she would stand, along with the other beggars. What to do next, she didn't know. And until the last moment, she wasn't sure her husband would let her go. "Where did you come from?" The woman's voice was angry. "Don't you have anything to eat?" Asking for Christ's sake. "You're dressed so well." Mildred didn't know what she was wearing, just some dress. Her husband zipped up the back this morning. "I guess I should have reached out and said something like this. Like all these people, have pity." Mildred didn't know the name of the village she was in now. But in any case, to get to her father or mother, she would need some money. She tried to remember their phone numbers, but the numbers danced in front of her eyes, confused, and she wasn't sure of anything. And the only address she could remember was the apartment where they had once lived together. She was sick, very sick. Someone put a coin in her palm, and only by touch, by the size of the money, Mildred could determine that it was 5 rubles. She wanted to do something to thank those who had given her the money. She could not kiss their hands, could she? She couldn't even see the hands. So she sang, "Your voice will come back to you in your time of need." She remembered someone's almost forgotten words. Mildred was prepared to sing in a voice that was broken and wrong, that the same beggars would ask her to be silent, but she was sure to be swept up and carried along. She did not know spiritual songs, and how could she know them? Romances came to mind, and for some reason she remembered their words, about white acacia bunches and black eyes, and about how she sat in anxiety at the open window. Her voice was gaining and gaining strength, so that she herself became afraid. Was there a limit to it, or did it rise from earth to heaven? Someone nearby cried, thinly, pitifully, but it was not a child, some old woman most likely. And then Mildred was taken by the arm, and a man's voice asked, "What is your emergency?" "It's the priest, Father Alexander," it suggested in a whisper from somewhere off to the side. Apparently, everyone had already realized that the singer was blind. "And so, here's the money they threw at you. I collected it. Put your hands up." And then she was sitting somewhere in the temple because it smelled like incense. And the phone number she remembered turned out to be right. And her mother cried into the phone and said she was going to pick her up. She was on her way. Probably not even the impressionable cleaning lady at the police department believed her story. Mildred said she had a fight with her husband and left. Yeah, just like that, in a fit of emotion, just up and left to spite him. Didn't even call a cab, went through the woods to town. And got lost, of course. I think someone bit her, probably a snake, because she was sick for a while. And she doesn't remember a lot of things, or like how she ended up in this village. She probably got a ride from someone. You realize this isn't even a white thread. The white threads were just put on top. Finally, the investigator couldn't stand it. "You're lying to me. Who are you protecting? Who are you afraid of?" "That's all I know," Mildred repeated mechanically, like an automaton. The only reason she was left behind was because she didn't want to press charges against anyone. It was easier for the police. They found her, she was alive, and that was all right. Mildred's father insisted that the coroner call her husband. But Erin wasn't at home, and faithful Pete, shrugging his shoulders, said he didn't know where his master had gone, or for how long. "He doesn't report to me." The medical examinations were of little use. The parents saw that their daughter had changed dramatically, from a blossoming girl to a colorless woman of indeterminate age. The doctors said that there were no critical changes in the body. In time, Mildred would get stronger, the nevroses could be brought under control. As for her eyesight, well, people live blind. Mildred didn't have to think about what to do now, how to make a living. She got a disability, but that wasn't the answer, of course, and it wasn't even the little money. Mildred would go crazy locked up in four walls, so she accepted when she was called to the House of Culture. She was organized as a leader of some fake circle, but in fact she became a decoration of all the evenings and concerts. After a while, people went to see her, and then she was invited to sing at a big concert on the main stage of the city. There was television, rave reviews wrote, and journalists. Mildred prophesied a career, asked if she did not want to try to be treated abroad, surprised that she does not suffer at all-star disease. And it seemed to her that all the worst happened to her yesterday, that not a year has passed, and one night. And this fear settled in her soul, tormented her more than the darkness before her eyes. He couldn't believe it when he saw her on the news feed. He hadn't had a television in his house for a long time, and he didn't read newspapers, but he used the internet as his only window to the world. Leaving Mildred to her fate, he saw two possibilities. Most likely, she would contact her parents and live very quietly, dependent on her mother. It would be a struggle for survival, like other people with severe physical disabilities. Or she will not want to upset her loved ones, to show them what she has become. Then she will hobble around for the rest of the century, or she will end up in some boarding school for the disabled or just get drunk. There's no third way. But when he saw her in the picture, getting out of the expensive car, when he recognized Mildred, even though she wore dark glasses, his rage rose up in him. She had managed to fool him after all. He had found no trace of the boy. He had not been seen alive or dead since his escape, and Mildred herself had settled down well, while he, on the other hand, was forced to live quietly, without attracting attention. It wasn't fair, and for a moment, he realized that justice had to be done. Himself, the instrument of retribution he chose was the very snake of which Mildred had spoken. Small but fast as lightning, death would come no later than 45 minutes after the bite. No one would even know to find an antidote in that time. He was so absorbed in his idea, so focused on it, that the plan came together very quickly. The snake would fit in the case, and it would be so easy to hide it among the bouquet of flowers. When was the next time the newfound star would take the stage? He looked at the playbill and almost laughed. She was supposed to perform on an outdoor stage in a city park. If anything, he could hide unnoticed in the crowd. Or maybe he'd want to stay and watch the performance to the end, so she could finally go to the other world, where she'd be waiting for him to go before his eyes. It will be easy, because she won't see him. She won't realize who handed her the bouquet. And at that very moment, he'll open the case. Every morning when Mildred woke up, the first thing she did was to sing some musical phrase, checking to see if the voice had disappeared. She saw it not as something inalienable that would stay with her forever, but as a miracle that came to her, a miracle that lasted and lasted and lasted. This is how Indian summer, the gift of autumn, can be delayed for a week or two, but every morning you look anxiously outside the window. Whether the clear warm weather has not changed to endless cold rain. For this concert, her mother had chosen her a long, light dress with a wide belt. She assured her that it suited Mildred very well. Mom had learned to drive the car too during that year. They arrived shortly before the concert began, and while they waited, they sat near the stage, on a bench that was drowned in lilac bushes. Mildred was silent, and her mother did not disturb her, realizing that her daughter should tune in to the performance, to that high mental elevation without which it is impossible for a true artist to go to the audience. And then came a woman organizer, and taking Mildred under the arm, led her to the stage, helped her up the steps, and left her only after she had put a microphone in her hand. Mildred was called for an encore, again and again, but she only shook her head. The other performers waited their turn. "Come, Sabu," she heard her say. "They are bringing you flowers." It was a rare occasion, if ever one could remember one, when Mildred was not handed bouquets, and here she stood at the edge of the stage, bent over, the flowers in cellophane crunching slightly audibly in her left hand, and to her right one of the admirers pressed his lips. Mildred froze. She recognized that scar, those scarred lips. "Vince," she said almost fearfully. Is that you? Wait, I'll be right down." She knew which way to go, where the stairs were by the stage. and near the stairs she was picked up by someone's strong hand. And now she is already standing on the hard ground and feels the furry side of the dog. You're not alone. You have no idea what has happened to me in all this time. I have no idea, said the voice she happened to remember all this time. I know. Oh, but how? Oh, Vivian told me. He really wanted you to be told he's alive. We've got him. You picked him up. That's how it happened. Our fisherman saw him first, and now he lives with us. He's got no family left. Nobody wants him in the world. Bird put her hands on her head. It was impossible that it could have turned out this way. Vince touched her shoulder. Oh, they're still bringing you flowers, he said. Later, Mildred tried to reconstruct the picture, but couldn't. She had been standing next to him, but the memory had definitely shattered into fragments. She reached out for the bouquet. A stifled growl, Vincent's shout, a sudden movement beside her, and a heavy groan. And the blood drained from her face, and the darkness before her eyes began to dissipate. Or dog's dog bite, she heard around her. And then she saw him, this terrible man who still appeared to her in her dreams. And now he was lying in front of her in the dust and squirming, tearing his throat with his fingers, as if he did not have enough air, and a small snake was slithering on his body, raised its chiseled head and hissed, warning the others that she was not to be trifled with. People scrambled away, unable to understand. Vincent wanted to draw her away too. He had hardly seen the black foreign visitor before, but Mildred knew the price of its bite. Did she get to the dog before it bit her? Is the dog all right? Right on the lawn, he began to examine the dog. He must be okay. If she'd knocked a man off his feet like that, the dog would be finished. Right there. He had never thrown himself out of the blue before. And then he grabbed his hands and suddenly, out of nowhere, a snake. What the hell was that? He caught Mildred's eye and realized she could see. And she knew that if she went back, if she dared to approach her ex-husband and empty his pockets, there must be an antidote hidden in there somewhere. When taking one of his pets with him, he made sure to take the antidote for its bite. Or because accidents can happen, he told her it was so long ago in some past life. But now it could have saved his life. And that vial of antidote is probably the only one in the whole city. I don't think the medics here have an antidote for rare African snakes. Mildred hugged the dog and buried her face in his gray fur. Then Vince, holding her by both hands, helped her up. Let's get out of here, said Mildred. Mama's probably looking for me. You can tell me all about it on the way, and you tell me. And they went on, saying something to each other, sometimes interrupting each other. And a gray dog like a wolf trotted along beside them.